In the spring of 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 lockdown, the world was eerily quiet, and I took that opportunity to escape the confines of my small apartment. A devoted backpacker and outdoor enthusiast, I decided to spend some time camping and exploring the solitude of various national parks. One of my destinations was a remote creek nestled in the heart of Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. Life before this trip had been complicated, to say the least. A mistake I made at work the previous year caused significant financial losses for several people, leading to a backlash that left me with a tarnished reputation. The fallout forced me to quit my job, change my phone number, and even move to a new apartment. For months, I endured harassment, an endless stream of messages, some threatening, from unknown numbers. Though it eventually stopped, the psychological toll lingered. This trip was supposed to be a break from all of that, a chance to reconnect with myself and the wilderness. I packed up my gear, loaded my truck, and made the 3-hour drive to the trailhead. The parking lot was empty when I arrived, which wasn't surprising. It was early in the season, and people were adhering strictly to lockdown measures. The thin blanket of snow crunching beneath my boots reminded me just how isolated I was. With no other footprints on the trail, it felt as though I had the entire wilderness to myself. After a steady hike, I reached the creek, which, despite the cold, was still flowing. Its gentle sounds provided a calming backdrop, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. I found a spot slightly off the main trail and began setting up my campsite. The quiet allowed me to immerse myself in the task, pitching the tent, gathering wood, and starting a fire. After cooking a simple meal of sausages over my portable stove, I settled into a chair beside the fire with a book, enjoying the crisp evening air. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, the world around me was bathed in darkness. I turned on my headlamp and decided to indulge in a few hits from a joint I had brought along, hoping it would help me relax. For a while, it did. The combination of the firelight, the star-filled sky, and the gentle murmur of the creek made me feel as though I had finally found the solitude I'd been craving. But that tranquility didn't last. My phone buzzed unexpectedly in my jacket pocket, pulling me out of my peaceful reverie. It wasn't unusual for me to receive texts. My family occasionally checked in, but when I unlocked my phone, my heart skipped a beat. The message was from an unknown number. The area code 475 wasn't one I recognized. The text read, "How's the camping going, buddy?" A chill crept down my spine, but I tried to brush it off, assuming it was some kind of mistake. I replied cautiously, "Who is this?" A moment later, another message came through, "It's beautiful out here." My stomach twisted as I read the next one, "I see why you came up here." At that moment, my relaxed state evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. Someone knew I was camping. Not only that, they made it sound like they were nearby. I shot to my feet, scanning the darkened forest with my headlamp, turning in a full circle as I tried to spot anything unusual. The surrounding trees stood like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches reaching into the night sky. I grabbed my backpack and pulled out my P365 handgun, my fingers trembling as I checked the safety. The weight of the weapon offered a small measure of comfort, but not much. Normally, I would extinguish the fire before heading to bed, but the idea of being surrounded by total darkness made my skin crawl. Instead, I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire to burn low. I unrolled my sleeping bag and climbed inside, the gun now resting beside me. My phone sat in my lap, the screen glowing faintly as I waited for another message. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and I began to regret smoking the joint. The high had amplified my paranoia, making every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig outside the tent sound ominous. I tried to distract myself, first by picking up the book I had been reading, but I couldn't focus on the words. Frustrated, I switched to watching videos on YouTube. A true crime documentary seemed like a strange choice given my circumstances, but it kept my mind occupied for a while. Then, my phone vibrated again, pulling my attention away from the screen. The message was short and cryptic, "Doesn't matter anymore." My heart raced as I stared at the screen, the light from the phone illuminating the edges of my trembling fingers. I typed back, "How did you know I was camping?" My question was met with silence. No response. My breathing grew shallow as my mind raced through every possible explanation. Was this a prank? Could it be someone I knew? Or worse, was it one of the people who had harassed me last year? But how would they know where I was? My campsite was isolated, tucked deep into the woods of a national park. The impossibility of it all made my anxiety skyrocket. I told myself that it had to be a coincidence, though deep down, I didn't believe that. The fire outside had burned down to embers, and the night had grown impossibly quiet. Without the usual chorus of insects or rustling leaves, the silence pressed in on me, amplifying every sound. Then, I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow. My blood ran cold. Someone, or something, was walking outside my tent. I froze, clutching the handgun with both hands, and strained to listen. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, until they stopped mere feet from the tent. My heart pounded in my ears as I saw a flash of light, a quick, sudden burst that illuminated the tent walls. It looked like someone had taken a photo. I didn't dare move. My mind raced with panic as I considered my options. Should I confront whoever was out there, or stay hidden? Before I could decide, the footsteps started again, retreating this time, fading into the distance. The silence returned, but my phone buzzed once more. With shaking hands, I unlocked the screen to find a photo of my tent, taken from outside. The accompanying text read, "Have a good night." A surge of adrenaline overpowered my fear, and without thinking, I unzipped the tent and fired 2 rounds into the air. The deafening cracks shattered the quiet, and I heard the sound of someone running away, their footsteps crunching rapidly through the snow. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the gun steady as I screamed into the night, "Get out of here!" Though the intruder was gone, the thought that they might still be lurking nearby kept me on edge for hours. I sat in the tent, the handgun resting in my lap, as I waited for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and hiked back to my truck without looking back. Even now, years later, I can't fully explain what happened that night. Whether it was a stalker, a prank, or something far more sinister, one thing is certain, I'll never camp there again. The anxiety from the bizarre situation began to weigh on me like a heavy fog. I couldn't shake the possibilities spinning in my head. Was this some twisted prank by a friend or family member? Or, more chillingly, was it connected to those who had harassed me in the past? If it was the latter, how on earth could they have known where I was camping? That unsettling question haunted me, sending waves of paranoia coursing through my mind. To distract myself, I pulled out my phone and scrolled aimlessly, letting random videos fill the void of silence in my tent. The glow of the dying fire outside seeped through the tent's fabric, dimming by the minute until only faint embers remained. In winter, the forest takes on a different kind of silence, no crickets chirping, no rustling leaves, just the occasional sigh of the wind. Normally, I'd find this solitude peaceful, a welcome break from the chaos of daily life. But tonight, it was suffocating. Whenever the video on my phone paused, the oppressive stillness seemed to magnify every thought racing through my head. Then, breaking that silence like glass shattering in a quiet room, I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow. My heart stopped. The sound was deliberate, measured, and steadily approaching. I grabbed my handgun with trembling hands, flicking off the safety as my breathing quickened. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were only a few feet away from my tent. Then they stopped abruptly, leaving nothing but the sound of my ragged breaths and the thundering of my pulse in my ears. For a brief moment, I thought, no, I prayed, that whoever or whatever was out there had moved on. But then a flash lit up the tent walls, brief and bright. It was as though someone had shone a flashlight directly at the fabric or, worse, had taken a photograph. My stomach twisted as the realization hit me, I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out there, close enough to see me, close enough to invade my space. I strained to hear anything, a rustle, a retreating footstep, but the silence had returned, deafening and oppressive. My phone buzzed in my lap, and I nearly dropped it in shock. A new message appeared from the same unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, my thumb hovering over the screen, heart pounding in anticipation. When I finally clicked on it, I felt the air leave my lungs. The image staring back at me was my tent, captured from the outside, surrounded by the darkness of the forest. The photo was followed by a text that read, "Have a good night." Something inside me snapped, and a rush of adrenaline replaced the paralyzing fear. Without thinking, I unzipped the tent, burst outside, and fired 2 shots into the air. The gun's deafening roar shattered the night, echoing through the woods. I heard the rapid crunch of footsteps retreating, fading into the distance. They were running. I stood there for a moment, gun still raised, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The forest had gone eerily still again, as if holding its breath. I shouted a warning into the night, my voice shaky but forceful, "If you come back, I swear I'll shoot you." My own words hung in the air, feeling both empowering and futile. The thought that someone had been close enough to photograph my tent was horrifying, but even worse was the realization that they had been watching me, lurking in the shadows for who knows how long. Shaking, I climbed back into the tent and zipped it up tightly, as though the thin fabric could shield me from whatever dangers lay beyond. For hours, I sat there wide awake, gripping the handgun with both hands, every muscle in my body tense. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, amplified by the silence. I couldn't sleep, every small sound outside made me jump, every shadow cast by the faint glow of the fire made my mind race with possibilities. Was the person still out there, hiding just beyond the trees, waiting for me to let my guard down? The thought was enough to keep me on high alert, my finger hovering near the gun's trigger. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I must have dozed off. When I awoke, the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the treetops, illuminating the snow-covered ground in a soft golden light. The sight filled me with relief, as though the daylight had banished the terrors of the night. I stepped out of the tent, blinking against the brightness, and surveyed my surroundings. The fire had burned down to cold ash, and the air was crisp and still. There were no signs of the intruder, no footprints apart from my own, no discarded belongings, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. Yet, the text messages and photo on my phone were undeniable proof of what had happened. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my eyes constantly darting to the tree line, half expecting to see a shadowy figure emerge. The hike back to my truck felt longer than the journey in. Every crunch of snow underfoot made my heart race, every rustle of branches sent a shiver down my spine. When I finally reached the parking lot and saw my truck waiting for me, I nearly collapsed with relief. Throwing my gear into the back seat, I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors before taking a moment to catch my breath. As I started the engine, I couldn't resist one last glance toward the trailhead. The forest stood silent and still, bathed in the soft light of morning, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickly pulled out of the lot, the tires crunching over the snow as I sped away, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. Looking back, I still can't fully explain what happened that night. Was it a stalker, someone who had followed me into the woods with malicious intent? Or was it something else entirely, something that defied logic and explanation? I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that I haven't been back to that campsite, or any campsite, since. The experience left a lasting mark on me, a constant reminder that the wilderness, while beautiful, can also be deeply unsettling. To anyone who ventures into the great outdoors, I offer this advice: stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and always be prepared. Because out there, in the shadows of the trees, you never know who, or what, might be watching. When our dads were together, especially with a few drinks in their systems, they loved to mess with us, sometimes a bit too much. At the time, I was the oldest of the group at 13, followed by my brother Adam and cousin Jake, who were both 10, and then the youngest, Joe, at 9. After lunch, we convinced our dads to help us set up a campsite in the woods, and they agreed, probably a little too enthusiastically given their tipsy state. They led us beyond the property line to a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. The ground there was covered in soft, mossy patches that Uncle Jim called deer beds. He mentioned he'd camped there before and assured us it was the perfect spot to pitch our tent. Setting up the massive tent was a joint effort, though mostly orchestrated by our dads, who gave us a half-hearted, slightly drunken tutorial on how to assemble it. They made sure we participated in every step, teasing us whenever we fumbled with the poles or tangled the ropes. When we were done, the tent stood tall, a surprisingly large shelter that could comfortably fit the 4 of us. We stuffed our sleeping bags inside, feeling accomplished, and then returned to the house to spend the rest of the afternoon playing games outside. At dinner, the mood shifted. Our moms were visibly uneasy about the plan to let us camp in the woods alone. They voiced their concerns, insisting we were too young for such an adventure without supervision. But our dads brushed off their worries with laughter, my dad even joking, "Don't worry, you'll hear their screams if something goes wrong." It got a chuckle out of the group, but looking back, it was an eerie foreshadowing. Later that evening, armed with flashlights, extra blankets, and a deck of Uno cards I'd packed for entertainment, we followed our dads back into the woods. As the house disappeared behind us, the forest seemed to grow darker and more imposing. By the time we reached the tent, the glow from the house was long gone, swallowed by the dense trees. My dad and Uncle Jim left us there with confident goodbyes, retreating to the warmth and safety of the house while we stayed behind in the cold, quiet wilderness. At first, the night was exactly what we had imagined, fun and carefree. The tent was lit up with our flashlights, which we'd propped up in a circle to create a cozy glow. We played round after round of Uno, laughing and teasing each other about who was the worst player. Time passed quickly, and for a while, it felt like we were just 4 kids on an exciting adventure. But then, as we were shuffling the cards for another game, a sound broke through the quiet night, a scream. It was distant but unmistakable, piercing the stillness and cutting through the cool night air. We froze, our eyes darting toward each other, the same look of alarm mirrored on each face. "It's probably just a fox," I said quickly, trying to sound calm. I'd read somewhere that fox screams could sound eerily human, and I clung to that explanation. Joe, who looked the most scared, seemed to relax a bit at my words, and the rest of us tried to shake off the unease. We returned to our game, pretending the scream had never happened. But it happened again. This time, it was louder, closer, and far more human. The atmosphere in the tent shifted instantly. None of us were laughing anymore. We sat in silence, listening, our eyes wide with fear. Joe looked like he was on the verge of tears, and I could feel my own pulse quickening. I told everyone to turn off their flashlights, plunging us into darkness. We crawled into our sleeping bags, huddling in silence as we tried to convince ourselves it was still just an animal. Then came the footsteps. Rapid, deliberate crunching sounds in the leaves outside the tent. They grew louder, closer, until it felt like whoever, or whatever, was out there was just a few feet away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then, the footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence returned, but it was far from comforting. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes every second feel like an eternity. And then, without warning, a blood-curdling scream erupted, so close it felt like it was right outside the tent. It was high-pitched and raw, filled with a gut-wrenching intensity that made every hair on my body stand on end. The tent began to shake violently, as if someone, or something, was clawing at it from the outside. We all screamed in unison, a mix of terror and desperation. Jake and Joe were crying, their fear palpable, while Adam and I shouted for whatever it was to leave us alone. In a moment of sheer panic, I unzipped the tent door and yelled, "Run!" One by one, we scrambled out of the tent, flashlights in hand, and bolted into the woods. The sprint back to the house was the longest, most terrifying moment of my life. Every crunch of leaves beneath my feet felt deafening, every shadow in the trees seemed to shift and move. The fear of being chased was overwhelming, but none of us dared to look back. By the time we reached the edge of the property, we were all screaming, our voices carrying into the night. Our family was already outside, drawn by our frantic cries. Breathless and trembling, we tried to explain what had happened, the screams, the footsteps, the violent shakings of the tent. Their faces reflected our horror, and for a moment, it felt like they understood. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My cousins Jamie and Christina, along with my sister, weren't outside with the others. A horrifying thought crossed my mind, and I turned to my dad and Uncle Jim, accusing them of sending one of the girls to scare us. But my dad's face hardened, and he shook his head. "They're in bed," he said firmly. The realization hit us all at once. Whoever had been outside our tent wasn't anyone we knew. My dad and Uncle Jim grabbed their rifles and headed into the woods, determined to find whoever, or whatever, had terrified us. They returned an hour later, empty-handed and shaken. The next morning, in the safety of daylight, we helped dismantle the campsite. None of us said much as we packed up the tent and carried everything back to the house. The forest, which had seemed so inviting just a day earlier, now felt menacing and cold. That night was never repeated. We never camped in those woods again, and even playing outside after dark felt impossible. Whatever was out there, it left a scar on all of us, a haunting reminder that the woods are filled with mysteries we may never fully understand. The events of that night marked the end of our camping adventures in those woods, and, frankly, the end of our desire to explore anything too far removed from the safety of home. We packed up what was left of the campsite the next morning, carefully avoiding much conversation as we worked. The cheerful excitement we'd felt the previous day had vanished, replaced by a lingering sense of dread that seemed to weigh down on all of us. Even in the daylight, the forest felt different, less like an escape from the world and more like a place we weren't meant to be. As we carried the tent and supplies back to the house, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every so often, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching us from the shadows. But the woods were empty, or at least they seemed to be. Still, the unease from the night before clung to me, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. Joe, usually the most chatty of us, was completely silent, gripping his sleeping bag as if it were a lifeline. Jake, who tried to act brave during the chaos, now stuck close to me and Adam, his nervous glances betraying the fear he tried to hide. Once we reached the house, the adults tried to lighten the mood, joking about how we'd survived our big adventure in the woods. But their laughter rang hollow. They'd seen the look on our faces when we came tearing through the trees, screaming in terror. They knew something had happened out there, something we couldn't fully explain. And while they dismissed the idea of returning to search for clues, the unspoken consensus was clear: we weren't going back. Whatever, or whoever, had been outside our tent wasn't part of the family, and they didn't belong there any more than we did. That experience changed the way I saw the woods. Growing up, I'd always loved the outdoors, the way the trees seemed to stretch forever, the earthy smell of damp leaves, the quiet calm that felt so far removed from the chaos of everyday life. But after that night, the woods no longer felt peaceful. They felt alive in a way I couldn't understand, as though they were watching and waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to wander too far. I stopped going outside after dark, even if it was just to grab something from the yard. The thought of stepping into that darkness, where anything could be hiding, sent a shiver down my spine. Looking back, I still can't say for certain what we encountered that night. Was it a prank gone too far, or something more sinister? Maybe it was just a random stranger passing through the area, though that explanation raises even more questions. Why were they screaming? Why did they shake our tent? And how did they vanish without a trace? The rational part of me wants to believe there's a logical explanation for everything, but deep down, I'm not so sure. The way the scream sounded, so raw and inhuman, yet eerily familiar, still haunts me. And the way the tent shook, as if someone was clawing at it with a desperate intensity, it's not something I'll ever forget. Years later, when I try to explain the experience to others, I can see the skepticism in their eyes. I know how it sounds, like something out of a bad horror movie or a campfire ghost story. And if I hadn't lived it, I'm not sure I'd believe it myself. But every detail, every sound, every moment of terror, it's all etched into my memory as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. I've replayed that night over and over in my mind, searching for answers, but the truth remains elusive. Whatever happened in those woods wasn't normal, and it wasn't something I'm eager to experience again. It's strange how one night can leave such a lasting impact. Before that trip, I'd been fearless, always eager to explore the unknown and push the boundaries of what I thought I could handle. But after that night, something shifted. I became more cautious, more aware of the dangers lurking in the places we often romanticize as safe and serene. The wilderness is beautiful, yes, but it's also vast and untamed, full of mysteries that defy explanation. And sometimes, those mysteries find you when you least expect it. I'll never forget the way the air felt that night, heavy and oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps crunching through the leaves, the way they stopped just outside the tent, and the deafening silence that followed. And I'll never forget the screams, those chilling, blood-curdling screams that seemed to pierce through the night and reach into the very core of my being. Even now, I sometimes hear them in my dreams, a haunting reminder of the fear I felt in those woods. If there's one thing I've learned from that experience, it's that the unknown isn't always something to seek out. There are places in this world that weren't meant to be explored, places where the boundaries between reality and the unexplained blur in unsettling ways. The woods can be beautiful, yes, but they can also be terrifying. And sometimes, it's better to leave them undisturbed. To anyone who hears this story and feels the urge to dismiss it as just another tale of youthful overreaction, I urge you to think twice. The world is full of things we don't understand, and the wilderness has a way of reminding us how small and vulnerable we really are. So if you ever find yourself camping in a secluded spot, surrounded by the vastness of nature, remember this: trust your instincts, stay close to the people you care about, and don't take the quiet for granted. Because out there, in the shadows of the trees, you never know who, or what, might be watching. The loudest bang we heard that night struck with such force it felt as though the earth beneath us trembled. My dad froze, his flashlight being fixed on the black void outside the tent. I called his name, desperate to pull him back from whatever had stolen his focus. He turned toward me slowly, his face pale and filled with dread. "It's standing there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. My heart sank. "What's standing there?" I asked, my voice trembling as I gripped the edge of my sleeping bag. He shook his head, still staring out into the impenetrable darkness. "I don't know," he finally muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. "It's like a wall of darkness." Without another word, he scrambled into the tent, zipping it shut behind him. He clutched the small knife we'd brought along, a laughable defense against whatever was out there, and sat vigil by the door. Meanwhile, I buried myself in my sleeping bag, every nerve in my body on high alert. Then, it started, a sound that's almost impossible to describe. It began as a low hum, so faint it was almost imperceptible, but it wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling. It seemed to vibrate through the air, pressing against my chest and making it difficult to breathe. My dad whispered, "Do you hear that?" I nodded, unable to speak, too afraid to make even the slightest noise. The hum grew louder, resonating deep within us, as though it were coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then it changed. The hum gave way to something far more chilling, a guttural, otherworldly growl that sounded nothing like any animal I'd ever heard. It was wet, deep, and primal, a sound that seemed to cut through the stillness of the night and pierce straight into my soul. It reminded me of something out of a nightmare, something alien and incomprehensible. The only comparison I could make was to the monstrous growls you'd hear in horror movies, but even that didn't do it justice. This sound wasn't crafted for fiction, it was raw, real, and terrifying. Neither of us moved. The weight of fear pinned us to our spots as the noises continued to grow and shift, each one more unnatural than the last. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every breath, and every vibration in the air. My dad sat rigid by the tent's zipper, the knife trembling in his hand as he stared out into the darkness, ready for something. I lay completely still, trying to control my shallow, panicked breathing. There was a small mesh window near my sleeping bag, but I refused to look through it. The thought of seeing whatever was out there, or worse, having it see me, was too much to bear. Then, in the midst of all the chaos, something even stranger happened. The noises stopped. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to fade, and everything went completely silent. I don't remember trying to sleep, I don't even remember how it happened. One moment, I was frozen in terror, and the next, I was waking up, disoriented and lying flat on my back in the tent. The shift from panic to unconsciousness was so abrupt that it felt unnatural, as though we had been forced into sleep by some external force. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. My first instinct was to check the time, but when I reached for my phone, I found it completely dead. I looked over at my dad, who was still clutching the knife, his face a mask of confusion and exhaustion. "Check your phone," I said, but he shook his head. His, too, was dead. Both had been fully charged the night before, but now they were lifeless. We cautiously stepped out of the tent, sticking close to one another. The air outside was cold and unnervingly still, the kind of silence that feels oppressive rather than peaceful. The fire we had stoked before diving into the tent had burned down to ashes, leaving no trace of the roaring flames from the night before. The food we'd left on the picnic table remained untouched, as though nothing had disturbed the campsite, but we knew better. We stood there for a moment, backs to each other as we tried to shake off the lingering sense of dread. My dad muttered something about needing to pee, so we stayed within arm's reach of one another, scanning the tree line for movement. The forest, which had felt endless and alive the day before, now seemed alien and wrong, as though we didn't belong there. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of silence and hurried movements. We packed up our campsite as quickly as possible, neither of us saying much. The normally mundane task of rolling up sleeping bags and dismantling the tent felt monumental, as though we were desperate to escape before something else happened. It wasn't until we were safely in the car, driving away from the campground, that we finally spoke about what we'd experienced. I felt like we were being hunted, my dad admitted, his voice low and filled with unease. I nodded, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Me too, I replied. It felt wrong. Like something was waiting for us to make a mistake. When we told my mom about the experience later, she didn't believe us. She suggested we might have been drugged or inhaled something strange, but we knew better. Whatever had happened that night wasn't the result of an overactive imagination or a chemical reaction. It was real, and it had left an indelible mark on both of us. To this day, we still don't know what we encountered in those woods. My dad insists he saw something, a shape, a presence, but he can't describe it in any concrete terms. It wasn't human, he says every time we talk about it. And it wasn't natural. The experience changed us. We haven't been back to that campsite, or any campsite, since. The thought of venturing back into the wilderness, no matter how beautiful, feels impossible. Whatever was out there that night showed us a side of nature that most people never see, and we've been unable to forget it. The wilderness, for all its beauty, holds secrets that defy explanation. And sometimes, it reminds us that there are places we aren't meant to tread. That night in the woods was one of those reminders, a chilling, unforgettable lesson that still haunts us to this day.